In this example, I want to look at launching an Amazon EC2 instance in order to deal with the Linux terminal, and specifically from that Linux terminal I want to set up an HTTP server, specifically Apache2 in this case. Okay, so right now I'm in the AWS console and I'm region specific, so I'm in US West 2 in this case. I'm going to launch an instance. And I'm just going to go ahead and name this my Linux Apache web server. Okay, and my personal preference is to use Ubuntu. It's just the Linux operating system that I'm most comfortable with, and I kind of know the file system layout better in Ubuntu than I do in other versions of Linux. So I'm choosing Ubuntu. I'm using the free tier eligible instance. And then the instance type, I'm using a T2 micro, which is free tier eligible. If you're not in the free tier, so if you're not in your first year, or if you've used up your 750 hours of T2 micro instance usage time, what's going to happen is you're going to get charged, it looks like 1.16 cents per hour. Okay, and again, this is perfectly fine for a low-end website. It works out to, I don't know, a little over $13 per month in this instance type. I can also choose higher level instances. So for instance, maybe I have a more memory intensive web application, or maybe I need more CPU power. I can choose different instances and I'd pay different rates on that. Okay, so for now I'm just sticking with the T2 micro instance. And then in order to be able to access the server, what happens is AWS is going to launch a Linux instance for me, and it doesn't give me username and password credentials. Instead, it gives me a key pair. Okay, so right here, it's going to ask me what my key pair is. I'm going to create a new key pair. So I'm going to create a key pair named Linux web server. Okay, so Linux web server, and I'm going to create that key pair, and I'm going to save it on my desktop. Okay, and what I will say is that when I create this key pair, whether it's on my Mac or if it's on Windows, what I typically will do with that key pair is I will save it into my profile directory. And what I mean by that is if I print my current working directory, let me blow up the font a little bit on that. If I print my working directory, right now I'm in my profile directory. So in the Linux world, it kind of looks like this. It looks like users and then username. So my username is B. Witkowski on this computer. This is my profile directory. I own this directory. I'm the owner of the directory, and basically no one else can access that directory. And then if I do a directory listing, you'll see that I actually saved that file onto my desktop, so I can change my working directory to my desktop. And if I do a directory listing there, you'll see that key file's there. And when I saved it, what happens is AWS requires the permissions of that file to be 400, meaning the owner of the file can read it, the group that's associated with the file does not have access, and then everyone else does not have access as well. And what that really means is if I do a directory listing with this flag AL, it'll show the permissions of that file. So right now you'll notice that it's saying that the owner can read and write the file. Okay, so that's what that permission is. So they're kind of grouped in groups of 3. So these first 3 characters, excluding the first character, because that would indicate whether it's a file or a directory. Okay, so the first character I'm ignoring. The next group of 3, though, those permissions are the owner's permissions. So in this case, B. Witkowski. So I'm the owner of that file. That's indicated here. So I own the file. I have read and write permission, but then you'll see that dash in the last position, and that is basically saying I have read and write permission, but I do not have execute permission, which is fine in this case because it's not an executable file. Okay, and then if I look at the next group of 3 characters, that group of 3 characters is associated with the group. So in this case, there's a group called staff, and all the members of that group then have this read permission, but they can't write and they can't execute. And then lastly, this last group of 3 characters applies to everyone, all the users that are not the owner of the file and don't belong to the staff group. Okay, so they can also read the file. So in this case, I would say the owner can read and write, the group associated with the file can read, and then everyone else that's not the owner or not a member of that staff group can also read. Okay, and the way we deal with those permissions, is the read is worth 4, the write is worth 2, and the execute is worth 1. And we just sum up those values for each of the different groups. So in this case, we're summing them up. Read's worth 4, so that's 4. Write's worth 2, so that's 2. And then we don't have execute, so we sum them up and we get the value 6. And then likewise for the next group, we sum them up. Read's worth 4, write's worth 2, execute's worth 1. We only have the read, so that's a 4. And then everyone else is kind of matching that same 4 because they have the read permission only as well. So in this case, I would express those permissions as 644. That's what this file is right now. Okay, so I'm going to leave it as that, but you're going to see where that's a problem. Okay, so right now those permissions are 644. So the owner can read, that's where the 6 comes from. The group can read, but that's, the owner can read and write, that's where the 6 comes from. The group can read, that's where the 4 comes in, and then everyone else can also read, that's where the other 4 comes in. Okay, so right now the permissions for that file are 644, and that's going to cause a problem for me later. But we'll fix it, and I want to show you how to fix it. So I have that key pair. We're actually going to set up a web server. So we want to work from the terminal, but in working with the terminal, the task that we want to actually complete is we want to set up an Apache web server. So I'm going to allow, so this is basically a firewall rule here. So there's a security group, so you can see it's a AWS firewall. We're creating a security group. We want to allow HTTPS and HTTP traffic to our web server, to our EC2 instance, our Ubuntu instance. Okay, it tells me it's going to give me 8 gigs of storage. That's fine. And then I'm just going to go ahead and launch this instance. And there's a couple of things to note about this instance being launched. What's really happening is Amazon's allocating computing resources to me, and it's installing a computing resource, think of it as a virtual computer, that has Ubuntu installed on it that I'm going to be able to manage, and I'm paying by the hour to access that computer. So you might have seen the instance state change from pending to running. Okay, so while it's running, I'm getting charged that 1.16 cents per hour. Okay, and it's rounded up to the nearest hour. So if I'm at 1 hour and 1 minute, I'm going to get charged for 2 hours. It always rounds up. Okay, so I'm getting charged right now, and I'm not on the free tier, so I will see this on my bill. Okay, I can decide that I'm no longer using this instance, and I can change the instance state to stopped. Okay, so when I stop the instance, that means I'm asking Amazon to stop billing me. I don't need those computing resources. Stop charging me for those computing resources. Okay, the one downside with stopping the instance is you'll see we're going to use this as a web server. AWS automatically assigns an IP address and a DNS address to my machine. Okay, so those are settings down below in the details. So I have a public IP address and a public DNS address. When I stop my instance and then restart it later, a lot of times I'll get reassigned a different IP address. So that's not the greatest thing in the world for a web server. And there are workarounds to that, but I don't necessarily want to cover that now. Okay, by me stopping the instance, it's not me saying I want to throw away my work. What it's basically saying is pause my billing for the time being, and I may come back to it. Okay, there are times though where you may just decide like, no, this is actually garbage. I don't need this anymore. I'm trying to clean up things. At that point, I can terminate the instance, and at that point, the file system for that instance would also be terminated, and I wouldn't have access to the data anymore. Okay, and I wouldn't be able to restart it. Okay, so those are the different instance states. Right now it's running though, and that means it's accessible to us. So if I click on this, then I'm going to get the details, and I need either the IP address, the public IP address, or the public DNS in order to be able to connect to it. But if I click into the instance ID, so if I actually click on this hyperlink, then there's a button up here to connect to the instance, and it's going to walk me through how do I actually connect to this instance. Okay, so the way I connect to a Linux instance is I use an SSH client. Okay, and you'll notice that it has a username Ubuntu. Okay, so it is already defined for me. Amazon created a user account named Ubuntu for my instance. And then if I go over to my SSH client, it's going to tell me open an SSH client, locate your private key file, run this command if necessary to ensure your key is not publicly viewable, connect to your instance, and then they give an example of how to connect. Okay, so they give us this SSH command. Okay, so I just want to launch a new terminal window, and I'm going to clear out of here. And if I launch a new terminal window, usually what's going to happen is it's going to automatically put me in my profile directory. That's going to be my current working directory, not on my desktop. And if I try to run this command that they gave me, it's going to complain saying, hey, that file, that key file, is not accessible. No such file or directory. Okay, what it's really saying is I'm trying to connect via SSH to this specific server, using this DNS address, with this specific username, and my credentials are in this key file. Well, we know that the key file is not in my profile directory. My key file is actually on my desktop, so it's complaining about that. It's not able to find that key file. So if I change my working directory to the desktop, and I issue that same command, and now I try to connect, you'll notice I get another error message saying I have an unprotected private key file. Okay, and if I go back over to their connection instructions, remember it said I have to make sure that the public key is not viewable. Run this command chmod 400. So what it's really saying is if I go back over to my terminal and I look at that key file, it's saying that the owner should be able to read the file, and only read the key file. That's where the 4 comes from. But then the group should have no access, so that's where the 0 comes from. And then everyone else should have no access, and that's where the 0 comes from. So I want to run the command that they're suggesting, chmod 400, on the Linux web server.pem file. Okay, and since I'm the owner of the file, I was able to do that. If I was not the owner of the file, I would have had to run that same command as the root user account or the administrative user account, and I would have had to run the command sudo chmod 400 and then the file name. And then it asks for my password. Okay, and that works fine as well. Okay, so now if I do a directory listing with that AL flag, you'll notice that that key file permission has changed. So now you'll notice that the owner can read but can't write any longer. And then the group, the staff group, has no access. And then everyone else has no access as well. Okay, so now that I've cleared up those file permissions, now I can actually run that command to connect to that remote machine. Okay, so now I'm connected to that remote machine, and you can see my prompt is actually changed. Now I'm actually on that Linux server. Okay, so that Linux server exists, and that's where I'm working right now. In this terminal window, I'm working on this EC2 instance, which is actually an Ubuntu instance. Okay, so if I go back to my instances, one of the things you notice is I have this public IP address. I'm going to copy it to the clipboard. I'm going to go to a browser window, and you'll notice that I get an error message saying the site can't be reached. Okay, so what's happening there is, if I can jump over to my server-side programming little infographic that I have, I'm making a request. So I'm making this request out to the server. It actually gets to the server. So my request gets to the server, but then you'll notice I'm getting an error message saying that the site can't be reached. Well, what's really going on here is I'm getting to that server, and I'm accessing that server on port 80. So I'm able to reach that specific server. But what happens is there's nothing there to actually handle the request. And when I say there's nothing there to handle the request, what I'm talking about is Linux is there. Okay, so I went through the AWS firewall. I had already configured that on port 80. I get to that machine, but that machine doesn't know how to actually generate a server response. And the reason it doesn't know how to generate a server response is there's no software that handles HTTP requests. The software that should handle that HTTP request is known as a web server. It's software that runs in the background that handles those requests. Okay, so in our case, I need an HTTP server. I need Apache2 in this case. I need that to handle this server response. So it handles the request. It says, oh, you're making a request for a web page. I'm going to send you a server response, so that we have this whole web interaction. Okay, and that doesn't exist right now. So what I want to do is I want to jump back over to that Ubuntu machine, and I want to install Apache. Okay, so the way I'm going to handle that is all of these different Linux variants. So some of them are kind of grouped together and some of them are not. Like Fedora and Red Hat are very similar to each other. I consider them the same variants. Ubuntu is its own variant. So what I can do is, and the reason I bring up the variants is because how I install software and what package manager I use is going to be different. It's kind of like the early days of app stores, right? So we've all dealt with the iOS App Store and the Google Play Store. Okay, so depending on the client operating system, I deal with a different app store, right? Same thing with Linux here. Depending on the variant of Linux, I deal with a different app store. Okay, so I want to get Apache2 from the App Store. And the way I do that is I do the apt or apt, and I want to do an install. So this is just a terminal-based command. I'm doing apt install, and then the software that I want to install, which is Apache2. Okay, so if I run this command right now, it's going to fail. So I'm going to go ahead and try to run this. I'm expecting a failure. And you'll notice that I get an error message saying, hey, couldn't open a lock file. But ultimately, you'll notice what is happening over here is I'm getting permission denied. So I'm trying to run this command with my current user account. Well, right now, I'm logged into this Ubuntu machine with the user account Ubuntu. The Ubuntu user account is not an administrator, but it has the ability to run commands as an administrator. Okay, so what I have to do is I have to type in sudo in front of the command that I want to run that command as an administrator. And I'm using the term administrator, but really what I mean is I'm running the command as the root account. Okay, so in Linux, the root account is very equivalent to an administrator account. Okay, so what I really want to do is I want to run sudo apt install Apache2. So I just want to put that sudo keyword in front of that command that I just issued. Okay, so I could type that all out. I could say sudo apt install Apache2. That would be fine. But I know that the very previous command is the command that I want to run. I just want to run it with sudo. So the shortcut that you can use for that is if I just want to run the previous command as sudo, then I can use the exclamation point syntax to run the previous command as an administrator. And you'll notice that it said, oh, you meant this, sudo apt install Apache2. Now I'm getting confirmation that it's okay to do the install. It's just going to take up some additional disk space. I have to confirm that that's okay. So I do. Okay, so basically it's downloading the necessary files and handling the install for me. Okay, so it looks like that completed successfully. I don't get necessarily a confirmation, but really the confirmation is the fact that I don't see error messages. So I'm just going to clear my screen. I'm going to go over to my browser window and I'm going to hit refresh. And now you'll notice that I am able to get the Apache default page. So if I jump back over to my server-side programming, I'm making a client request. I made it over to the server, and now because I made that request on port 80, and because the server has web server software installed, that web server software is monitoring that request, saying, oh, you made a request on port 80, that's my responsibility. I'm going to go ahead and handle it. I'm going to generate a server response that I can send back to the client. Okay, that's where Apache's fitting into this picture. Okay, so you'll notice that that is up and working. I will mention that this becomes a little bit awkward. So if I'm over in the instance details, so under instance, I'm in instance details. If I click on open address, so if I click on open address, you're going to notice that I get the site can't be reached. Okay, but if I am over here, it's working. So I have a lot of people will ask, you know, I am following along and now I'm getting this error message saying the site can't be reached. So when I open this address, you'll notice down in the bottom, very bottom left of my screen, it's indicating that it's HTTPS. So it's trying to open that file over HTTPS. Well, I haven't configured an SSL key for my website yet. Okay, so HTTPS is not going to work. So what I did is I copied this address. So I just copied the IP address, and over HTTP it will work. Okay, so we only have HTTP enabled. We don't have HTTPS enabled. Okay, this is the Apache2 splash screen. It kind of gives us details about the Apache2 installation. You'll notice that it's saying that this file is located at this location. So it's saying on the file system there's a file located at var www html, and the file name is index.html. Okay, so that's this file that's getting rendered in my browser. What I want to do is I want to make a modification to this index.html file so that we can verify that that is actually the case, and we can verify that that is how we can work with that file. Okay, so if that's the case, I want to change my working directory to var www.html, and I want to do a directory listing, and you'll see that there's a file, index.html, and I want to work with this index.html, and ideally what I would do is I would open up that file in Visual Studio Code, make a modification, and then refresh the browser page and see the modification in action. But that's not really the case here, and what I mean by that is I have this Ubuntu installation, but this Ubuntu installation does not have a user interface. I really want this Ubuntu installation just to be my web server, so it doesn't have any graphical components to it, and that's what allows it to run on such a small computing footprint, right? So I'm paying for that T2 micro instance, and it's running just fine because I don't require a lot of computing resources to run a web server. All it's doing is monitoring port 80 and 443. If a request comes in, it goes and reads a file and sends the file contents back. That's all that's happening right now. Okay, so it's not a lot of work. I don't have to render a user interface. So because I don't have to render a user interface, that also means I don't get to use the user interface to open up a nice text editor like Visual Studio Code. So instead what I'll use is I will use Nano. So Nano is the application. It's built into Ubuntu, and so I want to use Nano to open the file index.html. Okay, and you'll notice that it's an HTML document. Okay, and if I scroll down, right, so there's some built-in CSS here. If I scroll down, you'll notice that I eventually get to this Apache2 default page. Okay, so that seems to be okay right now. So let's say I want to go ahead and modify this. So I want to say this is Brian's modification. Okay, so I've made that change. I want to save that file. Well, down at the bottom of the screen, you'll notice that there's some commands. They're not traditional commands that you'd see in a traditional text editor like Visual Studio Code. There's no save, there's no save as. There is this option to write out. Write out is the equivalent to save, so I'm going to hit Control O. And it's asking me, do I want to write the file index.html? That's the file name that I want to use. And you'll notice I get an error message saying, hey, permissions denied. I don't have access to write to that file. Okay, so I'm kind of out of luck right now. I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm not going to save the modified buffer. I'm going to ignore that. And if I do a directory listing on index.html, you'll see that the root user account can read and write. The group associated with it is root. Okay, and the way Ubuntu Linux works is for every user account, so root being a user account, for every user account that's on the system, there's also a corresponding group on the system that has exactly that one user, which is root. So in this case, there's a user called root. There's a group called root that has the one user account, which is root. So in this case, these are one and the same. Okay, so the owner can read and write. So root is able to read and write. The group, which is also root, only has the read permission, but it's actually able to write because it's also the owner. And then everyone else is able to read the file as well. Okay, right now, when I'm on the system, when I open that file with Nano, I was the Ubuntu user account. So I would fall into this classification of user, which is everyone else. I'm not root, and I don't belong to the root group. But I still want to write to the file. So what I can do is I can open up index.html as the root user account. So I can say sudo nano index.html. So right now I'm running the nano command, opening index.html, but I'm doing it as the root user account. That's what the sudo in front of it does. Okay, so now if I arrow down and I make the same change, okay, so I'm still arrowing down. I went past it a little bit, and I say, here's Brian's modification. Okay, and I hit Control O really quickly, and it's saying what file name to write, index.html. I'm hitting enter really quickly, so it wrote those 363 lines, so it saved that file. And now I can exit out of the file. I don't really need to exit out of the file. I should see that change right away. And it looks like, I don't know what happened there. I don't know where that actually went. Okay, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of cheat this. I think it has to do with it's hidden behind that image. And you can see it's a floating element. Instead, what I'm going to do on the main page is I'm just going to go ahead and add my own h1 tag, Brian's modification. Okay, so I've saved it, and now if I refresh this page, you'll notice that Brian's modification shows up above. Okay, I think the other modification was getting hidden behind the image, but the modification did happen. Okay, so we're able to modify that file. It's not ideal to work in Nano. Okay, what I will say is that it's not ideal. It's also not ideal that only the root user can write to that file. And I'll go even further. If I change my directory, I go up one level and I do a directory listing on the folder. You'll notice that the folder is kind of the same way. It's a directory. The owner can read, write, and execute in the folder, but the group can only read and execute, and then likewise everyone else can only read and execute that folder. So what I want to do is I actually want to change the group associated with HTML to the Ubuntu group. I could also, if I want to, I could create a new group called developers. Okay, so there's a group add command. So if I do, I probably have to look this up because I don't do it all that often because I'm not a system administrator, but I can do a sudo group add web devs. Okay, so I'm creating a new group called web devs. Okay, and what I want to do is I want to say that the web devs is the group associated with this HTML folder. So I'm going to do a sudo change group to web devs for the HTML folder. Okay, and now if I do a directory listing and look at all of them, you'll notice that the web devs group is the group associated with the folder. And what I want to do is I also want to do that recursively. I want to do that to all the files in that folder. So I'm doing this recursively. Okay, and what that did, so if I go into the HTML folder, you'll see that the group associated with index.html is also the web devs group. Okay, so once I have that, I want to make the Ubuntu user account part of the web devs group. So again, I'm just going to do a quick Google search. I want to use Ubuntu add user to group. Okay, so ask Ubuntu. Okay, I'm going to accept the cookies. I'm doing a user mod. I'm adding to the group name and the username. Okay, so sudo user mod ag. The group name is web devs, and the username is Ubuntu. Okay, so now the Ubuntu user account is a member of the web devs. Okay. And now if I go up a directory, I still have that same issue of the web devs are not able to write to the HTML folder. Same issue that I'd have with the index.html file. I wouldn't be able to write to it. So what I want to do is I actually want to make a change. I want to enable that write permission on the directory. Okay, and I want to make that recursively to all the files within the directory. So I'm going to do a sudo chmod 774, and I want to do that recursively, to the HTML folder. Okay, and now if I do a directory listing with all the permissions, now you'll notice that the owner can read, write, and execute. The group can also read, write, and execute. And that group is actually the Ubuntu user account. So to test this out now, if we go into that HTML folder and we... Uh-oh. I don't know why I'm getting a permission denied error there. I think I should be able to read, but I'm not sure why I'm not able to. I wonder if the fact that I added that user to the group hasn't taken effect yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this connection that I have. So right now I'm connected with SSH to that server. I'm going to exit. So now I'm back on my Mac. I'm going to reconnect. And then I'm going to try to change my working directory to that HTML folder. Okay, and now you'll notice I'm not getting an issue there. And if I do a directory listing, I can see that the web devs are the group associated with index.html. And what I'm really testing here is, can I access or modify index.html as the Ubuntu account? So notice I'm not putting sudo in front of nano. I'm just saying I want to go into nano and modify index.html. Okay, so again, I'm going to scroll down to my modifications. So right now I have an H2 tag that says Brian's modification. And then I'm going to just append onto this updated. Okay, notice I'm able to write to that file, so I was able to write, and now I'm exiting out, and now I should be able to come back over and see that change. I don't know why I'm not seeing that change. Okay, you don't have permission to the resource. I think everyone should have read access. I might have screwed up the permissions in the HTML folder. It looks like everyone should be able to read that file. I wonder if the execute permission is causing problems there. Because I didn't have the execute permission before. I don't think it should matter, but I can try to change it back. So 764, and I want to do that recursively to the HTML folder. I don't think that should make a difference. So it is complaining about the fact that... So what I think is happening here is my web server is trying to read that file, and I'm getting an error message about being able to read the file. And I'm not really sure why it's causing that issue. So I had to do a little bit of debugging to figure out the issue of why I was getting that permission denied error. And it turned out that I have to have execute permission on that folder. So the permission that I'm actually looking for is 775. So I was able to do sudo chmod -r of 775 on the HTML directory. And then once I did that, I was able to then access the HTML directory. And if I do a directory listing to show all the permissions, you'll see that the web devs group is associated with it, and I have 775, so that I'm allowing the web server to be able to execute that file, and then I'm no longer getting the error message about not having access to it. So my web server has to be able to execute that file in order to run properly. Okay, so now I have a user account called Ubuntu. It belongs to the web devs user group. That web devs user group then has the correct permissions to access the folder and the files within the folder. So I'm able to work correctly. The last thing that I really want to cover here is I don't want to work using Nano. I do want to use Visual Studio Code. So let's say I use Visual Studio Code. Let me go out to my desktop. So I'm just going to launch a new terminal window, or a new tab. Okay, so I'm on my desktop. I create a new folder. Okay, so I create a Project 1 folder. And then I open that up in Visual Studio Code. Okay, and what I want to do is I want to create a new file here. I'm going to call this, I want a new file. I want a new file, index.html. And I'm just going to use an HTML5 template here. So Brian's Cloud Demo. Hello world. Alright, so a really simple page. Okay, so this is where I want to work, and it's really easy for me then to create, a CSS folder, a JavaScript folder. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. I want to delete that folder. A JavaScript folder. Having a little difficulty here. Okay, a JavaScript folder, maybe an images folder. Right, so I can do all of those things, and I want to work on my local machine because this is where I'm comfortable with. This is where I have a graphical user interface and Visual Studio Code and all the tools that I might want. But then when I get done, I might want to be able to take this file and move it out to the server. Okay, so in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a browser and I'm just going to do a search for SCP syntax. So SCP stands for Secure Copy. And I always use this hyperx.org example syntax for Secure Copy. Okay, and you'll notice that it gives some examples. So copying a file from a remote host to the local host, that's not really what I want to do. My Mac is my local host, and what I want to do is I want to copy a file from it out to a remote host. So if I look at the second example, copy the file from the local host to the remote host. Okay, so you'll notice that it's giving me syntax to do that. Okay, so it's going to be scp, my file name, and then my username at my remote host, and then what directory do I want to copy it into. Okay, so if I go back over to my terminal window, and I'm in project 1, so what I want to do is I want to do scp index.html, I'm doing Ubuntu at, and then the IP address of that remote server. And then I want to copy that file to the var www HTML folder. Okay, and you'll notice could not resolve hostname HTTP. I screwed up there. This is not over HTTP, it's over SCP, right? So wrong protocol. I just want the IP address there. Okay, and you'll notice I'm getting an error message saying, hey, that's fine that you want to do that, but you have to include the key file. Okay, so I have the syntax correct, but what I want to do is I want to include the key file, so -i, and then the key file is going to be located at, it's up a directory, so I could just say users, Witkowski, desktop, and then I can't remember the key file name, linuxwebserver.pem. I want to copy index.html. I'm using the Ubuntu username, and the location I'm copying it to is that remote directory. And I think that's the correct syntax. Okay, so now if I come back over here, now you'll notice it transferred that file. And now if I go back over to my Apache default page, you're going to notice that it's Brian's Cloud Demo and Hello World. I'm able to move my files. So if I make another change, so let's say I go out to Visual Studio Code, and I make another change saying that this is modified. Okay, so I just made the modification. I can just hit the up arrow and copy that file over again. And now if I go back over to my browser, you'll see that that modification happened. So I'm able to work on my local file system, on my local workstation. So in this case I'm using a Mac. I'm working locally, but then I'm able to move my files from my local machine out to the remote host machine. Okay, so this is a typical environment of how you might work. So you're going to have maybe a Linux server that's accessible to you, and then you got to be able to move files back and forth. You got to be able to manage permissions on that remote machine in order to allow that copy to happen. So that scp command that I used, it was still checking the credentials to say, okay, you're using the Ubuntu username. That Ubuntu username is a member of the web devs, and they do have write access to that folder. So all of the permission stuff that we went through was necessary in order to enable that scp command to actually work. Okay, so you can't just jump right into the scp command without modifying the permissions on that directory and on that file. Okay, so all of this kind of works together. We got a simple web server up and running in Ubuntu. We're able to kind of navigate around the terminal window. We were able to change the permissions in the terminal window. We did the Apache install. We ran commands as the root user account. So all of those things are going to be kind of critical skills as a web developer.